Hello, welcome to a video on car loans and the mathematics of financing a car. So in this video we're going to compute monthly payments and interest costs for a car loan, understanding the types of leasing contracts, pros and cons of leasing versus buying, different kinds of car insurance, monthly payments of new and used cars, and solve problems related to owning and operating a car. Long run. Alright, so some basics here. A loan you pay off with weekly or monthly payments typically, sometimes other time periods, but not usually. Those are called installment loans, and the advantage of an installment loan is you get to use the product immediately, even though it's technically not yours yet. Alright, the disadvantage is because you have to pay interest for that. You pay a lot more money than what you could have if you had cash to buy it. Alright, so we're going to start off with a concept called fixed installment loans, which means the monthly payment is always the same thing. So when we have a fixed installment loan, the payment, PMT, is our form of payment. It's a little bit different than the value of P like we saw in the last video. But P is the loan amount, that's the principal that we're talking about even back in the first half of this chapter. P is the amount that we borrowed. N is the number of times that we have to pay this payment in a year. T is the number of years, and R is the quoted interest rate that we were given. Okay, notice that this right here is a negative power. Okay, it's very important that you see that negative. Alright, so a lot of things that we've seen before, this 1 plus R over N, is a very common theme through all these different formulas that we're seeing. So R divided by N. NT being an exponent is very common. Again, you'll see sometimes that we're calculating payments. A lot of times we'll see a negative power. Sometimes we're subtracting from 1. Sometimes we'll subtract 1 from these values. Alright, let's use this formula. Suppose we're going to decide to borrow a car, $20,000 for a car. And we can select one of these two payments. Alright, 3-year loan, 7%. A 5-year loan at 9%. We want to find the monthly payment, the total interest for A and B, and then compare the monthly payments and total interest for the two loans. So what we're going to do is plug into this formula, and we're going to plug in the values here. Right, 20,000, that's going to be the value for P in both of these. The 7% and the 9%, that's going to be the value for R in each one at a time. N is going to be 12 in both cases because they are monthly payments. Alright, and then T is 3 for one and 5 for the other. So let's plug in and see what happens. So there's loan A, just plugging in. There's the 20,000, the R, that 12 is in. Alright, 12 times 3, and we plug all that stuff in and simplify, we get 618 again. This is just plugging in directly into the calculator again we can do for these. Alright, so there's everything going in. Notice the parentheses. Everywhere there's a parentheses or a bracket. Alright, so 1 minus 1 plus 0.07 over 12. Again, I multiply these out. I always go ahead and multiply those out. And there's this 617.54. Just make sure you see where the homework software is telling you where to round to. This is rounding to the nearest dollar, okay, but it could round it to the nearest cent. Okay, so just pay attention to the problem. Alright, and then the other one, same thing. If we multiply that out, we're $618. We're multiplying that, this same 36, this N times T. That's how many payments we're going to have. Minus the amount of the loan, that's how much we're being charged to borrow this $20,000. That's the interest. The $2,248 is just interest for that $20,000 loan. Okay, part B, same formula, just plugging in some slightly different numbers for R and slightly different numbers for T. Right? Everything else stays the same. Because we are extending it over 5 years rather than 3 years, we pay less. But because we're making a whole lot more payments, and not, it doesn't help that the interest rate's a little bit higher, we're paying a lot more in interest. Okay, lower payment, right? Pretty significantly lower payment, but a lot more interest in the long run. Okay, so it's what happens. if your payment is less, because we're extending the loan out more. Typically, if we're going to make the loan go longer term, we're going to charge you a higher rate. We mean a bank. Like I'm a bank, I guess. But that's going to increase the total amount of interest. That's going to increase how much it's going to cost you for us to give you this amount of money. So it's just, it just depends on your situation. Which one can you afford this? If you can afford this, then it's going to cost you less to borrow this amount of money. But if you can't afford this, if you can afford this, and you think you can afford it for a longer period of time, then this would be the way to go. Sometimes we just have to because of finances. If you can afford that extra $200 a month, and that's going to save you a significant amount of money in the long run. Leasing alternative. Many of you probably lease a car. If you lease a car, you're basically paying a specified amount of money over a already specified amount of time to use the car, right? It's basically like renting a car for a longer period of time than a typical renting of a car. And a closed-end lease, so each month you make a payment based on how much you think you're going to use it for. And then if you when the lease ends, you return, and if you go beyond what you said you were going to use, then you have to pay a fee for going beyond that. Typically a fee per mile beyond what you said you would use it for. Alright, an open-end lease. So each month you make that fixed payment based on the car's residual value. So the residual value is the estimated resale value at the end of the lease. So the lease ends, you return the car, you make the payment based on its appraised value at the time compared to its residual value. Okay, but if that appraised value is less than residual value, then typically you have to pay some money, a portion of the difference. Usually that's because you went over the mileage, or there was some type of damage. But if the appraised value is greater than, if it's still in better shape, or you went way less than the miles or something, then typically you don't owe anything at the end of that lease. And on very rare occasions, you may receive a refund. Alright, but the more likely thing is if they appraise it and it's less than what they expected it to be, then you have to pay some money. Alright, what's the advantages of a lease? Very small down payment, sometimes no down payment at all. You can kind of get that with cars, but not as often. Lease payments are typically lower than a loan payment because of the fact that they'll get the car back at the end. And most people can lease a very nice car that you would never be able to afford to buy because those payments are so much lower. And then, you can call this an advantage if you want. You don't have to deal with selling a car at the end. Selling a used car sometimes is very tough. You don't get a whole lot of money for a used car at the end. Nothing, depreciates like a car does. So it's hard a lot of times to sell those for what you want to get out of them. When you're leasing a car, you don't have to worry about that. You just take it back. Alright, but the disadvantages, obviously, that's not your car. The lease ends, you don't have a car. Mostly lease agreements have those mileage limits that we talked about. And if you go beyond that, then you can really start racking up charges. When you start considering those charges, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it gets up to be the same price as it would be if you were loaning. If you were had gotten a loan to actually finance the car. You really have to return those things in pretty good condition for you to not have to pay any fees for that residual versus the expected amount that we were mentioning before. Alright, the lease doesn't cover maintenance, and there are penalties for ending the lease early if you just get tired of the car, if you want to get a different car. You can get out of your lease, but a lot of times you have to pay a penalty. Alright, insurance. So the things that you're required to get with insurance is liability coverage. So bodily injury liability covers the cost of lawsuits if someone else in a different car or even your car is injured or killed in an accident where you're the person at fault. And then the property damage liability covers damage to other cars and property from negligent operation of your vehicle. Okay? If you back into a different car or something like that, you have to have those types of coverage in most states. All right, then other types of insurance: collision, that's the damage or loss of the car. If you're in damage or loss of your car if you're in an accident. And then comprehensive protects your cars from things like fire, theft, something falling, landing on your car, hail, collision if you hit a deer on the road. Those are comprehensive, and those are additional to the liability coverage. And again, they should start to be pretty expensive if you get full coverage. All right, now, if you're thinking about buying a new car, you're narrowed down two choices. This is your new car, it costs $25,000, and it can be financed with a 4-year loan at 7.9%. A used car option. It's a 3-year-old model of the same car. All right, it's like a 2012 version of 2015 or 2016, 2013. All right, so instead of $25,000, you can get it for $14,000, and your used car loan is 4 years, right, but 8.45%. What's the difference in monthly payments between the two financing options? All right, so for the first one, the brand new one, $25,000 one with 7.9% financing monthly options. All right, so we're plugging that in. 4-year loan, so we end up with about $609 as our monthly payment. All right, so that's for our new car. All right, for our used car, it's a little considerably less amount that we're having to borrow. A little bit higher interest rate, okay, still a 4-year period. Because of that initial principal amount is $11,000 less, we're getting a significantly different payment, $609 versus $345. Okay, so $264 between the new car and the used car. So if it's coming out of my pocket and that $14,000 one's not just a complete clunker, yeah, I kind of see the cost savings each month. I almost buy 2 of these for the amount of getting that new one. But it's new. Nobody's driven it. You can kind of, if the oil changes and the maintenance has been done correctly, or you don't necessarily know that with a used one. But still, that's a pretty big difference. All right, another example. Buying a car, obviously a huge expense. The car continues costing money after you purchase it, right? Because we got to get tires, and we got to get the oil change, and we got to get the brakes checked, and we got to get the tires rotated, all these different things. So all these different things are expenses that go into the car other than just owning it and paying that monthly payment. Insurance, licenses, registration, taxes, all the interest on the loans, that's just a bunch of different things that go into this stuff. Okay. Alright, cost of gasoline. Hopefully this isn't completely new to you, but if you take your number of miles that you drive in a year, divide by your miles per gallon, and then you multiply that by the average price of a gallon for gas, then you'll get an estimate of your annual fuel expense. Now this, typically this is an estimate unless you've kind of kept really good track of it. This is, always fluctuating, so this would have to be like an average or an estimate. And then this also actually fluctuates depending on what type of roads and everything you drive on. So, typically these are kind of estimates anyway. But let's come up with a kind of a ballpark idea for these. Suppose you drive 24,000 miles a year and gas averages $4 per gallon. Okay, you can tell this is kind of a little bit older. We've kind of gotten a little bit better than that in the last couple of years. What would you save by owning a hybrid car averaging 50 miles per gallon rather than an SUV that only averages 12 miles per gallon? All right, and then if you deposited those monthly fuel savings at the end of each month into an annuity that pays 7.3% compounded monthly, how much would you have in 6 years? So let's look at these things going back into this formula here, and then into the savings formula from the last section to answer part B. So this is our formula that we're plugging into, the hybrid SUV. We're taking that 24,000 miles we drive per year, we're dividing by the miles per gallon, all right, and then we're multiplying by the fuel costs. So we see that SUV, because of that number we're dividing by, is so much less than this number. We get such a much bigger number that we're having to spend in gas. So if we take that $6,000 extra that we're having to spend to buy that SUV, or run that SUV, I should say, in a year, and we throw that into our savings formula, let me see, that should be a little bit smaller, we end up with about $45,000 that we could end up with taking that $407 per month of that $6,080 that we're saving per year. If we divide that by 12, we get the savings per month. If we take that $507, put it into this account we were talking about, and put it in there for 6 years, however the amount of time we typically are paying off that car or something, that's about $45,000 we would have saved. That it would accumulate it to, not necessarily that we would save, but it would accumulate it to in that 6 years. Okay, so that's just supposed to illustrate why hybrid vehicles are selling, or why they typically were selling at such a high rate when gas was outrageous a few years back. But anyway, this crossover between sections, we're going from one section to the other. That's going to be something that you have to deal with in the next couple of sections, and that's why watching the Excel video on how to plug all these different formulas in and creating spreadsheets for all these different formulas is going to be so beneficial to you as far as time goes.